Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Haunted History with Sherry Brake. This is the first one, straight out of the chute, going to one of my favorite ghost stories, Mary, Queen of Scots. In my end is my beginning. I'm going to repeat that. In my end is my beginning. Mary, Queen of Scots embroidered that sentence on her state of cloth as she neared her execution. This execution was on the orders of her cousin and fellow Queen Elizabeth I of England. Mary also embroidered a beautiful phoenix bird. Phoenix is a mythological bird that was reborn in the ashes of its predecessor. And I'm curious about this. Was Mary suggesting that her death would be the rebirth of her reputation? We can only wonder. So, as a paranormal investigator and an author, a paranormal researcher, history is the foundation for the ghost stories. There's always a good, solid foundation with most of these old ghost stories, and they go back to history. So let's touch a little bit on the history of Mary first to see why she would haunt some of these locations. So Mary was Queen of Scotland from December 14th of 1542 to July 24th of 1567. She was the only surviving legitimate child of King James V. So she was just 6 days old when her father died. We're not sure why he died. Perhaps it was from the effects of a nervous collapse following the Battle of Solway Moss, or perhaps it was drinking contaminated water while he was on campaign. Wee little Mary was crowned just 9 months later. Truly a child queen. Now, portraits of Mary show that she was a beautiful child, very attractive. She had a small, oval-shaped head, long, graceful neck, bright, beautiful auburn hair, hazel brown eyes, and just smooth, pale skin. She really was a pretty child, and later on as a woman, strikingly attractive. At some point in her infancy or in childhood, she caught smallpox, but it did not seem to mar her perfect features. Mary was eloquent, beautiful, and especially tall by 16th century standards as she grew to an adult height of 5 feet 11. She was truly a beauty. In 1558, she married Francis, the Dauphin of France. He ascended the French throne as Francis II in 1559. Mary was not Queen of France for long, though, as she was widowed December 5th of 1560. After her husband's death, Mary returned home to Scotland. 4 years later, she married her first cousin, which was common back in those days, especially if you were royal, Henry Stuart, also known as Lord Darnley. Their union was unhappy, and in February of 1567, they'd only been married 7 years. Lord Darnley was found dead in the garden at Kirkhofield after a huge explosion occurred in their house. Of course, you can imagine tongues wagged and conspiracies raged on about Mary, our beautiful little Mary. Could she have committed this crime? Nevertheless, years passed and she soon married James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, who was generally believed to be Darnley's murderer. So the plot thickens. Following an uprising against the married couple, Mary was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle on June 15th and was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. After an unsuccessful attempt to regain the throne, Mary fled to England seeking protection from her first cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, whose kingdom she had hoped to inherit. Queen Elizabeth ordered her arrest because of the threat that was presented by Mary, who had previously claimed Elizabeth's throne as her own and was considered the legitimate sovereign of England by many English Catholics, including the participants in the Rising of the North. Between April 21st and 23rd of 1567, Mary visited her son at Stirling Castle for the very last time, unbeknownst to her. On her way back to Edinburgh on April 24th, Mary was abducted, willingly or not, by Lord Bothwell and his men and taken to Dunbar Castle, where some stories suggest that he may have raped her. On May 6th, Mary and Lord Bothwell returned to Edinburgh. On May 15th, they were married according to Protestant rites. Originally, Mary believed that many nobles would support her marriage, but the relations quickly soured between the newly elevated Bothwell, who was now the Duke of Orkney, and his former peers, and the marriage proved to be deeply unpopular. Catholics considered the marriage unlawful, so 26 Scottish nobles, known as the Confederate Lords, turned against Mary and her husband, Lord Bothwell, and they raised their own army. The Lords took Mary to Edinburgh, where crowds of spectators denounced her as an adulteress and a murderer. The following night, she was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle on an island in the middle of Loch Leven. Between July 20th and 23rd, Mary unfortunately miscarried twins. On July 24th, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. Her downward spiral was beginning to spin out of control. Mary apparently had expected her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, to help her regain her throne. That did not happen at all. After 19 years in custody in a number of castles and manor houses in England, our sweet Mary was tried and executed for treason, for her involvement in 3 plots to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. She was convicted on October the 25th and was sentenced to death. At Fotheringhay, on the evening of February 7th, 1587, Mary was told that she would be executed the next morning. She spent the last hours of her life in prayer and distributed some of her belongings to her household and wrote her will and a letter to the King of France. There was a large scaffold that was erected in the great hall, and it was draped in black cloth, mourning cloth. It was reached by 2 or 3 steps and furnished with the block, a cushion for her to kneel on, and 3 stools for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness the execution. The executioner Bull and his assistant knelt before her and asked forgiveness. This was typical for the executioner to request the pardon of the one being put to death. Mary replied, "I'll forgive you with all my heart for now. I hope you shall make an end of all of my troubles." Her servants, Jane and Elizabeth, and the executioners helped Mary remove her outer garments, revealing a velvet petticoat and a pair of sleeves in crimson brown, the symbolic color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. There was also a black satin bodice and black trimmings. As Jane disrobed Mary, Mary smiled and she said, "I've never had such grooms before, nor ever put off my clothes before such company." Mary was then blindfolded by her servant Jane with a white veil embroidered in gold, and she knelt down on the cushion in front of the block on which she positioned her head, and then she stretched out her arms. Her last words were, "In manus tuus, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. But Mary was not beheaded with a single strike. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second blow severed the neck, except for a very small bit of sinew, which the executioner cut through using the axe. Can you even imagine? Can you even fathom such an execution, such sloppiness, whether deliberate or not? But afterwards he held her head aloft, and he declared, "God save the Queen." And at that moment, her beautiful auburn tresses in his hand turned out to be a wig. and the head fell to the ground, revealing that Mary had very short gray hair. A young man who was present at the execution reported to his uncle afterwards that after her death, her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off, and that a small dog owned by the queen emerged from hiding among her skirts. The items supposedly worn or carried by Mary, by certain eyewitness accounts, stated that all of her clothing, the block, and everything that was touched by her blood was burned in the great hall fireplace. Now, Mary was a haunting presence even before her death, a threat to some at court, but she was also loved by many. Mary's colorful life and reputed beauty would have assured her fame. The crowning of her son James of Scotland as James I of England secured her place in the history books, but there are those who claim that she still seeks acknowledgement and that even today her physical presence can be felt more than 4 centuries after her death in 1587. She has become not only Scotland's most famous queen, but also its most ubiquitous ghost. Now let's talk about why a ghost would haunt before we discuss the locations where Mary's ghost has been seen. All right, so those of you that have done paranormal investigations or paranormal research probably subscribe to the same theory as myself, that ghosts haunt because of a job not finished. Ghosts will haunt because they are tied to a location. And occasionally a ghost wants revenge. So I think all 3 of those circumstances would apply to Mary, Queen of Scots. So let's talk right now about what happened to Mary's body after her execution. From her severed head, there was a wax death mask that was made, which was displayed on a black cushion, and her body was quickly embalmed. But she was not buried until July 30th, when her remains were removed to Peterborough and interred opposite of Catherine of Aragon. The burial took place private at night, and the next day there was a very low-key public service and a procession in her honor. There was very little reaction in Scotland, although James made a public show of sorrow, at the same time being careful not to offend Queen Elizabeth. There was some outrage from Queen Elizabeth, who claimed it was all a dreadful mistake, and she had punished all those involved. A requiem mass was conducted at Notre Dame in Paris on the 12th of March, and it was accompanied by some brief displays of grief from the royal court. However, after a short time after her death, all the tributes and the pamphlets, at first, some in England and others in France, cast Mary as either a romantic martyr or a Jezebel, even worse. Opinions about the dramatic events of Mary's life and death continue to divide along comparable lines, and they have doubtless fueled claims about her many ghosts. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, and where her ghost has been sighted. Mary had often made frequent visits to Stirling Castle, so I think it would only be natural that her apparition has been seen there. A ghost is said to haunt the castle, known as the Pink Lady, and it's believed to be that of Mary. At Bothwick Castle in Midlothian, Mary is said to appear dressed as a page boy. She stayed there in 1567 after her doomed marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, before escaping disguised as a man. Her freedom was short-lived, however, and Mary ended up prisoner at Lochleven Castle, where her spirit is said to have lingered long after another great escape. Hermitage Castle in the Borders is also said to be haunted by Mary, on the borders of the area between Scotland and England. And it's kind of extraordinary that she's seen at Hermitage Castle because she never visited there. But it's believed that the link is provided by her husband Bothwell, who stayed there shortly before they were married. Now, as far as Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, where Mary was put on trial and executed, it was virtually razed to the ground in the early 17th century. Very little remains of it. But some of the stone and an old oak staircase, which she walked down to face her execution, were used to build the nearby Talbot Hotel in Oundle. Mary's ghost is said to be a regular ghost. Legend also says that the paneling in the bedrooms of the Talbot Hotel, a greatly decorated window, and the staircase are all from the castle, which is now just a grassy mound. These were all rumored to have been bought by a local developer named William Whitwell. So it's possible the staircase that sits in the hotel now is actually the same one that she descended on the morning of her execution. The legend also goes on to say that her executioner stayed at the Talbot the night before his grim task, dining on pigeon pie. All of this has led to ghostly tales of the haunting of the Talbot Hotel. After Mary Queen of Scots died, her body was embalmed, and it's said that her entrails were secretly buried within the castle grounds. This beautiful queen then lay in a lead coffin for nearly 6 months before being buried. She was first buried in Peterborough Cathedral with great solemnity by Elizabeth I orders, but James I ordered that her remains be brought to Westminster Abbey in 1612. She was exhumed 25 years later by her son and laid in a very ornate marble tomb in Westminster Abbey, next to her cousins Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor. So let's talk about Edinburgh Castle in Edinburgh, Scotland. I personally have been there 6, maybe 7 times. I have walked the hallways. I have been in the Grand Hall. I have stood in the chapel. I have walked the grounds, and every single time that I have visited the castle, I have thought about Mary. Now, when you visit Edinburgh Castle, hopefully you will, you're going to see more than the cannons, the chapels, the battlements, the grand buildings. It's a medieval fortress that is definitely worth its salt. It also has a whole array of restless spirits that can make an appearance on your visit. Hey, you never know. Keep an open mind. Now, Mary really knew how to put on a show, so she hosted many grand affairs at court, carefully choreographed everything from the banquet food to the entertainment and the clothing that her court would wear. On several occasions during her reign at Edinburgh Castle, she used it for major royal events. But her most obvious connection to Edinburgh Castle is the fact that she gave birth to the future King James on June 19th, 1566. She was very shaken by the recent murder of her secretary, Rizzio, and she abandoned the comforts of Holyrood House, just 1 mile away, for the security of Edinburgh Castle. When the time came, she moved to the tiny room, which is now known as the birth chamber, where she gave birth. Now, if you visit the castle today, you can check it out for yourself. Mary's former bedchamber and the birthing room. There are many people who have visited that chamber, that birthing room, and have felt the presence of Mary. They have felt her joy and her sorrow. And I'll tell you what, I've stood there in that room all by myself, and I have felt as if there were other people in the room with me. You know, that feeling that you're not alone. Now, another entity that is seen at Edinburgh Castle has a connection to Mary Queen of Scots. It's her very own mother, Marie de Guise. She was the Catholic mother and regent of Mary when Mary was just a child. Mary de Guise found herself on the losing side of the Scottish Reformation. When she died in June of 1560, her corpse was kept at the castle for months, wrapped in cloth and kept in a lead coffin to keep the smell at bay. It took a while before the Protestant nobles finally allowed her remains to be shipped home to France. Now, her ghost is known as the Grey Lady, a mysterious lady dressed like a 16th century noblewoman, has been spotted wandering around the older parts of the castle. Other times she has been seen standing in the halls weeping. And it's considered that she is the ghost, the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. So let's talk a little bit about symbolism. The tomb of Mary lies at the southern end of the Henry VIII Chapel, a location which in itself underpins her place in the English succession. Perhaps appropriately, Queen Elizabeth I, her tomb is at the opposite end of the chapel and is located in the north aisle. The locations of these monuments, opposite each other in both life and death, make a curious study when considering the relationships of these two queens and life. Since ancient times, ghost stories, tales of spirits who return from the dead to haunt the places they left behind, they've all figured prominently in the folklore of many cultures around the world. A rich subset of these tales involve historical figures ranging from queens to kings and politicians to writers and gangsters, many who have died early, violent, or mysterious deaths. So the places that are haunted are usually believed to be associated with some occurrence or emotion in the ghost's past. They are often a former home or the place where he or she had died. Aside from actual ghostly apparitions, traditional signs of hauntings range from strange noises, lights, odors, or breezes to the displacement of objects, bells that ring spontaneously, water faucets that turn on by themselves, or even musical instruments that seem to play on their own. As in England, where the number of historical establishments claim Queen Victoria slept here, it's legion and numerous, and the same holds true in Scotland for Mary, Queen of Scots. In her relatively brief 45 years of life, Mary seems to have spent at least one night in just about every castle of note in Scotland. Between everyday living at her royal residences, numerous Scottish progressions, various attempts to escape a multitude of threats, and the early years of her imprisonment, she went from what we know today as familiar Scottish landmarks like Edinburgh Castle to nearby forgotten ruins like Spiny Palace in the Moray region of eastern Scotland. Even after all these years, she reigns on and on. That makes her an extremely popular spectral resident of Scottish castles. And yet, she does reign on, our unfortunate Mary, Queen of Scots. The castles that she wandered, the homes she lived in and visited, the very prisons where she was held captive are alive with history and with spirits. It seems as if she still permeates the atmosphere. There's just something about Mary. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Haunted History with me, Sherry Brake. Interested in my events, programs, ghost tours, and international tours? Check out my website at www.hauntedhistory.net. I'm on Instagram as River Styx, and my various Facebook pages are under Sherry Brake or Haunted Heartland Tours. I've been investigating the paranormal and researching all things odd and intriguing for over 30 years. My love for the paranormal has resulted in over 20 books being published in the last 20 years. I own Haunted Heartland Tours, and I'm thrilled to be celebrating 20 years this year as a business owner. And I never see my calling as a true job. And my calling, you ask? Well, that's to share my insight, my stories, my love of this crazy, dark, twisted, and intriguing subject that we call haunted history. Ghost stories don't need to be made up. History is frightening enough. Don't you agree? And until we meet again.